Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 5, 2011, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Tim Murphy, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a story about American jobs. This is the story about American jobs and the story of where our money is misspent, how it hurts states, the United States, and how we can change that trend. It's how some U.S. policies currently are hurting U.S. citizens, and it's a story of how we can change policies, we can clean up our environment, create jobs, have clean air, clean land, and clean water. It's about growing jobs without increasing our debt, borrowing from China, or raising taxes. This is a story of the new American dream for the next generation. The story that says if we have the will, we also have the way. The story that makes America back to work again. And best of all, it's a story that can come true. We can do this because we have the road to energy independence and American prosperity mapped out with this bill, H.R. 1861. Today, a number of members from both sides of the aisle, the Bipartisan Working Group on Energy, will describe America's needs and show how this bill provides the means to rebuild our aging infrastructure and meet America's growing energy needs, and will grow millions of jobs. Not for 90 days, not for one election season, but from 20 years into the future. This bill moves us towards energy independence. But first, before we get into that, I want to talk about the energy needs of the world and what's happening with our own economy. We all recognize, and every member of this House is concerned with the debt of this nation, which is now $14.5 trillion. It's 97% of the value of our economy. It's $45,000 for each man, woman, and child, and growing at $58,000 a second. We are all concerned that more than 25 million Americans are out of work or looking for more work. We are all concerned that we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs to other countries in the last decade. We all know that global demand for energy is going to grow by 53% by the year 2035. And total U.S. consumption of liquid fuels, including both fossil fuels and biofuels, is going to rise from about 18.8 million barrels per day to 21.9 billion barrels per day by the year 2035. Now, we know that many people would like to have us get off of oil, but we are still going to need oil not only for transportation, but for manufacturing, for plastics, and for chemical development. It is not something we can turn our back on, but it's something we need to recognize that this is a treasure out there that we can use not only to stop sending our money overseas, but also to develop American jobs. Keep in mind, we can turn our energy around through energy because energy equals jobs. We import 65% of our oil, and some of that from hostile regimes. The U.S. currently imports roughly 20%, or 5 million barrels a day, from members of OPEC. The United States spends about $1 billion a day on foreign oil, or $129 billion each year from OPEC nations. By converting to natural gas, 18 million diesel trucks and fleet vehicles, which return to a central location every night, would cut OPEC imports in half. Choosing to enact no change in policy related to natural gas is the same as choosing to remain reliant on OPEC nations for an economic vitality. Our bill helps finance this conversion. Gas costs families about $2,200 more a year than it did in 2009. And this House, this chamber, has talked about energy independence since the 1973 oil embargo. But the demand for energy is growing and growing. And unfortunately, OPEC exerts control over world oil prices and has asked that it someday be $200 per barrel. We think it affects our economy now at where it is. Imagine what would happen when it reaches that level. The Department of Interior, however, estimates that we have between 86 billion and 115 billion barrels on our outer continental shelf. on our outer continental shelf. That is enough oil and gas to replace imports from Venezuela and Saudi Arabia for the next 80 years. Extensive tracts of oil, which, by the way, were last surveyed for the most part in the 1970s. And it's quite likely that also given areas that have not been reviewed or surveyed since then would have many times that amount. Offshore exploration, including the revenues that come from the leasing, from the royalties, is about $440 billion alone. When you add everything else that can come from this, with over 1 million jobs a year, with manufacturing, the economic impact of this exceeds $8 trillion overall for a country. And new federal revenues are estimated to be between $2.2 and $3.7 trillion over the next 20 years. Just put that down. Thank you. Our option is to continue to buy from foreign nations which aren't friendly to us. Think of what happens with this $129 billion a year we send to OPEC nations, nations that oftentimes we send blood and treasure of our soldiers and our money to go protect. And what do they do with our money as well? They build islands, great highways, palaces. Now, we recognize that many folks around the world are our allies, but we also have to recognize we are here to take care of our citizens and make sure our citizens have an opportunity to compete for jobs in America. Alternately, here's the problems America faces right now in our energy infrastructure. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, America's infrastructure is crumbling. It would take $930 billion to rebuild our roads and bridges, $87 billion for aviation, $12.5 billion to rebuild our dams that are breaking, or in our locks, $255 billion for sewer and water infrastructure rebuilt in America, where we're leaking massive amounts of water every year in our clean water. $75 billion for energy infrastructure in this nation, $50 billion for inland waterways, $50 billion for levees, $63 billion for rail, and $265 billion for our transit system. What we would do is open up those areas for offshore drilling, and quite frankly, I trust our ability to do it. Yes, there have been mistakes, but they have been rare. And I certainly trust our folks to explore for our offshore resources and make sure they follow environmental laws to the letter. But in this process of creating jobs and dedicating the revenue from this act, keep in mind, we do not raise taxes, we do not borrow from China, and we do not buy this oil from OPEC. Instead, we create our jobs. We create our jobs now and in the long term. We rebuild America's crumbling bridges and roads. We invest in clean American energy, not just talking about cleaning up our coal-fired power plants, not just talking about it would be nice to have nuclear power, not just saying it would be great if people could conserve more energy, because 40% of the energy of typical homes and buildings is oftentimes wasted through incredible energy inefficiency. We pay for that energy, but we don't get it. We pay to heat our homes and light our homes and cool our homes and offices, but whenever we are wasting that energy, that's power plants we don't need to have built. There's also wasted energy in the areas that have to do with how our grid structure is so inefficient. But we can actually clean up the environment and conserve energy, and we can do all of this without raising taxes, as we said. Now, I said this is a bipartisan bill, and I'd like to turn to a number of my colleagues today to talk about how this can be done and to hear the kind of support we have for this as we move